And the topic given to me is an evaluation and approach of a neck swelling. And we all know we have seen cases in a neck swelling which is being presented for examination. And invariably, we just think that this case may be a thyroid swelling. But before really coming down to the diagnosis of thyroid, there are certain things that we have to think of before labeling that swelling as a thyroid swelling. So the two main considerations that we have to do in this condition is the swelling a midline swelling or it is a lateral swelling? And depending on that, we can make a diagnosis of the type of swelling that it may be. And this is a picture of few of the swellings which are usually given to in the examination, both as a long case and a short case. So we have to, not all the swellings are thyroid swellings out here. It may be a branchial cyst, it may be a cystic hygroma, it may be an infected cyst, submandibular abscess, deep cervical abscess, lymph nodes, or thyroid swellings. So whenever we see these sort of a cases for the residents, it is very important that we should know to come down to the diagnosis. We should know how to proceed in this type of scenario. And this is a very small algorithm which can tell us how we come down to the diagnosis of a swelling. So depending on whether the swelling is a solitary swelling or a multiple swelling, and the position of the swelling in the neck, whether it is present in the posterior triangle or it is present in the anterior triangles, the swellings can be divided. It may be right from cystic hygroma to a subclavian artery aneurysm to lymph nodes to thyroid gland to the thyroid isthmus elongation to a thyroglossal cyst, a carotid body tumor, salivary gland tumor, dermoid cyst, a cold abscess, branchial cyst, or lymph nodes. So this small chart gives an idea how to come down to a diagnosis whenever we get a swelling in the neck. This is for the residents to note. Please never always say a neck swelling will be a thyroid swelling for you, because few of these cases may be presented to you in short cases. So what about these cases? So these cases, as per the first criteria, whether are there a midline swellings or are there lateral swellings, or they are the swellings which is having both a midline and a lateral approach or a lateral extension. So again, we have to think of what are the type of swellings that these may be. And whenever we get these sort of swellings, yes, these swellings could be a thyroid swelling. But if we are thinking of them as a thyroid swelling, then the next question we should come into our mind is, what is the functional status of the swelling? If it is a thyroid swelling, if it is something which is present in the midline or it is extending into the lateral triangles, and there are certain characteristics which I'll be talking about which will tell us whether this is a thyroid swelling or not. So what is the functional status? Whether it is a euthyroid swelling or there is any hormonal imbalance which will be there in form of a hyper or a hypothyroidism. And the third thing that we should think of is this swelling causing any compression on the soft tissues? So this is another considerations which may have a bearing for us during anesthesia, which we have to evaluate preoperatively. So whether are there any compressive signs because of this swelling? So these are things that we should know. So coming down to the history, you have to see what is the onset of the swelling, what is the growth, the progress of the swelling, whether the swelling moves with swallowing or tongue protrusion. The swelling moves with swallowing, may be a thyroid swelling, but not all thyroid swellings move with swallowing. In a case where there may be a carcinoma, the swelling may be fixed. Secondly, if a midline swelling is present with moves with tongue protrusion, it may be not a thyroid swelling, but it will be a thyroglossal cyst. Then again, we have to see for any difficulty in breathing, swallowing, or speech. This will tell us about the compressive signs. This will tell us whether there is an involvement of any of the cranial nerves. Is there again a feeling of shortness of breath on lying down? This is another sign which tells us about the compressive sign. Is there any sudden increase in the size or pain in the swelling? This may go more towards the malignancy, that the swelling may be a malignant swelling. Any history of palpitation or vision loss, this will again show that this may be a case of hyperthyroidism. Again, you have to take a history of the weight loss or a weight gain, or menstrual disturbances in females. This will again give a history of the functional status. So the things that from this history point, what we can know of, we can make out what is the functional status of this thyroid swelling. And some of the important symptoms and signs which are present in different hormonal imbalances, I'll be just talking about. Please remember one thing, both hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism affect the same organ system. The only thing which is different is the manifestation in that particular system. So in a hyperthyroidism, it may be a heat intolerance to increased sweating to weight loss, to palpitation, shortness of breath or tiredness. The patient may be agitated, irritated, emotional lability, insomnia, depression, excitation. Patient may have undergone a number of psychiatric treatments. There may be a presence of mild diarrhea. There is oligomenorrhea or amenorrhea in females, and there may be some small muscle wasting of the hands or the face and the shoulder. While in hypothyroidism, if we go, the patient will be tired, weak, mentally lethargic, cold intolerance, weight gain despite a normal or a poor diet. They may again be breathlessness, but it may be associated with an ankle swelling, difficulty in thinking and speech clearly and quickly, dementia or hallucination. This is totally different. The neuropsychiatric manifestation is totally different from what is there in hyperthyroidism. Here there may be a progressive constipation. Menstrual disturbances may be in form of menorrhagia in females. There it was oligomenorrhea or amenorrhea. Here it may be a menorrhagia. In hands, there may be again muscle weakness or wasting may be present, and there may be an association of carpal tunnel syndrome in this hypothyroidism. So again, this chart again tells us what are the different manifestations. These are the different, all these points you have to take up whenever we are evaluating the patient and taking the history. So we have to take the history and all these points that are being shown out here. And again, the same thing that I want to show, almost the same sort of an organs may be involved in both hyper and hypothyroidism. The only difference is the manifestation may be different. So we have to think of all these things, and then we have to take the proper history. After taking a proper history, then the next stage comes, that is the examination. And what are the relevant points for a general physical examination is, if the patient has a facies, which is a mass-like facies, this may go more towards hypothyroidism. If there's a presence of protuberance of eyes and exophthalmos, this may again go towards hyperthyroidism. A moist skin will suggest thyrotoxicosis, while a dry skin is a feature of myxedema. An anemia may be a sign of malignancy or thyrotoxicosis. And the sleeping pulse rate is taken because this may tell us about the severity of the thyrotoxicosis which may be there in this group of patients. Coming down to the examination and the inspection, a normal thyroid is not visible. And if there is a small thyroid swelling, then a procedure known as a Pizillos method is done, where the hands are clasped behind the occiput, and then the resistance is given so as to make this small swelling prominent. The swellings move up with deglutition. The question asked is why? And by the end of my talk, I think the resident should be able to give me an answer why this swelling moves up with deglutition. Is there any extension of this thyroid swelling into the retroesternal area? And a retroesternal goiter is usually depicted by two things on inspection. One is there may be presence of dilated veins over the upper thorax. And secondly, the lower border of thyroid is not seen when we ask the patient to deglutate. So that is, this is something which is known as getting below the swelling. So if we are not able to see the lower border of the swelling, then yes, there is a chance that the swelling may be extending into the retrosternal area. Examination has to be done. It can be done both from the front as well as back. So it has to be examined both from the front and from the back. Usually the neck is slightly flexed. When we are examining from the back, what are the things that we are seeing? Basically, what we are seeing is the lobes and the isthmus portion. We are seeing the consistency, we are seeing the extent, we are seeing the nodularity, we are seeing the skin. All these things are usually palpated from the back. And if we are sitting in front, so what we are doing is, then the palpation method is known as a Leahy's method, where we sit, we push the gland to one side, and from the opposite hand, we palpate the gland again for all these features. We see for the firmness of the swelling, we see for the nodality, whether there are any nodality in these swellings, skin over these swellings, all these things can be seen. Consistency and mobility can be seen in this case. Now, getting below the swelling, I have said you should be able to inserate one finger between the lower border of the swelling and the suprasternal notch. If you are able to do that, so that tells us that there is less chances of the swelling having a retrosternal extension. We have to do a Pemberton signs, which I'll be talking about. Other test that we do is a Kocher test. Kocher test is we give a slight pressure on the lateral lobes, and because of this pressure, this will compress the trachea, and there may be a respiratory obstruction, a partial respiratory obstruction, which may produce stridor. So you do this test. This again tells us the whether this is causing compression or not. And tracheal position, if feasible in small swellings, can be confirmed. In larger swellings, it is not possible to palpate the trachea in these conditions. For percussion over the manubrium sterni again gives an idea whether there is a retrosternal extension of the swelling or not, because if there is a dull knot which is present, that means that there is some body which is there, and usually it is a thyroid which may be there. And on auscultation, a groove may be present over the carotids, and this is because of the increase over the lateral thyroid lobes, and this is because of the increased vascularity of the thyroid gland. Other things that we have to see, especially in cases of hyperthyroidism, is the eye signs. And eye signs that is usually seen is exophthalmos, Stellwag sign, which is a white palpebra, which is seen. There is a decreased blinking. Dalraffi sign, which is there where there is a lid retraction. Von Graff's sign, where there is a lid lag. Mobius sign, where there is an inability to converge. Griffith sign, where there is a difficulty for the lig eversion. And Joffrey's sign, that is due to loss of Brinkley. The questions usually asked at this portion is, why is there presence of exophthalmos? How will we know that there is a white palpebral which is there? And how will you do a converging test in this patient? So these are other things that you are supposed to solve. Examiners usually ask you. This is important. Ask the patient there may be a distended or there is an increased JVP, and this is indicative of SVC syndrome, and it is presence of due to the compressions of vessels against the thyroid at superior mediastinal inlet. So this is the reason why this.
बस आपका डिस्कनेक्ट हो गया है. हाँ, कुछ नेटवर्क इशू है या वी विल टेक ओवर, नो प्रॉब्लम. हाँ, मैं शेयर कर दे रहा हूँ, उनको करने दें.
Dr. Sahu, am I audible?
हाँ बॉस, अब ठीक है. आपका नेटवर्क चला गया था, लेकिन नाउ यू कैन डू. शेयर कर लीजिए.
So from where do I have to start?
Again, backslide, one slide backward.
One slide back. Trying to share my screen.
और
This will stop others.
आप दोबारा शेयर कर लीजिए बॉस. हाँ, अब आपकी फोटो दिख रही है, आप शेयर कर लीजिए दोबारा. हमारा आउट कर देते हैं, हमारा आउट कर दीजिए.
So
ठीक है.
यहाँ
हाँ,
से
पेम्बर्टन साइन से एक बार बता दीजिए बस. ठीक है.
So this is a Pemberton sign. This is Pemberton sign. This is usually done. This was usually done to know about the retroesternal extension of the thyroid. And here what we do is we ask the patient to lift the hands up above the head, very close to the ear. And we see the face of this patient. And what is usually noticed is there is a facial flushing. The patient may have a feeling of inspiratory stridor. There may be presence of distended neck veins. And this is indicative of SVC syndrome. And this SVC syndrome usually occurs because of the compression of the vessels against the thyroid at the superior mediastinal inlet. This is usually avoided nowadays because there are chances where this patient may even lose consciousness because of this decrease in the blood flow in the upper areas. The historically, one other science which was done was a Weiss criteria, which was used to diagnose hypothyroidism, where the score was taken both on the basis of the signs and the symptoms that the patient showed. And because of that, a score was there which ranges from plus 45 to minus 25. And more than 19 implied that there is a presence of toxic hypothyroidism. Less than 11 implies euthyroidism. Had a diagnostic accuracy of 85%. Again, no longer used, but just for a completion sake, I'm talking about these two criteria. Another is Zubrisky's clinical score for hypothyroidism. Again, every symptom and sign was given a score and ranged from 67 to 47. And highest weightage was given to sluggish ankle jerk and slow movements. Again, score of plus 25 or more suggested hypothyroidism, and a score of minus 30 or less excluded the diseases. So these are certain scores which was used previously to diagnose the hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. Now coming down to something about the physiology, what is the function of the thyroid gland? The thyroid gland is responsible for the growth in the body, the bone maturation of CNS, controls the BMR, controls the metabolism, has cardiovascular effects. So these are different things that are being controlled by thyroid. And we should know what are the cardiovascular effects of thyroid hormone. It has an increased sympathetic activity, increases the heart rate, improves the contractility, improves stroke volume and blood, increase oxygen consumption, decreases SVR but increases PVR, increases the automaticity and the excitability of the tissues, and increase systolic blood pressure with wide pulse pressure. So these are certain effects which the thyroid hormone have on the cardiovascular system. Regulation of thyroid hormones, we all know it is controlled through the pituitary, through a thyrotropin releasing hormone which acts on the anterior pituitary, hypothalamus, from which releases the thyrotropin releasing hormone, acts on the anterior pituitary, which secretes the thyroid stimulating hormone, and which acts on the thyroid and is responsible for the thyroid hormones, peripheral thyroid hormones. And this T3 and T4, which is produced in the blood, has a negative feedback mechanism by which the thyroid secretions of TSH and TRH and TSH is controlled by the peripheral concentration of T3 and T4. Few words about the thyroid hormone synthesis. It undergoes 4 steps. The 4 steps are iodine trapping in the thyroid gland, oxidation of iodine, and binding to tyrosine, the coupling, and the release and the cycling. These are the 4 steps which are responsible for a thyroid hormone formation in the thyroid. We are supposed to know this because in the examination this is usually asked. And why this is also important is the thyroid drugs, the antithyroid drugs that we are using, that the antithyroid drugs that we are using is also acts on particular areas on this very mechanism, so as we are supposed to know where these particular drugs act. Few words about thyroid function test. These are the normal values of T3, T4, free T3, T4 and TSH that we are supposed to know. We have to learn them, and it is the functionally important. Free T3 and free T4 is important for us for the normal functions to occur in the body. 95% of the thyroid problems can be diagnosed with these three hormones, that is the TSH, the free T3 and
बॉस आपकी
there is a
आपका अनम्यूट
connectivity.
हाँ ठीक है
I
ठीक
have
है
unmuted myself. There is a connectivity.
कोई नहीं करने दीजिए आपकी
Again, we coming down to this value where there is a low value of TSH but a normal free T3 and free T4. And few of the conditions where this occurs is when the patient is already taking thyroxine, where there is a subclinical primary hyperthyroidism, patient is on a high dose of steroid or inotrope infusion has been given. In this condition, repeat a thyroid function test after 6 weeks. Other condition is where there is a low or normal TSH with a low free T3 and T4. And the common causes is a patient who is unwell with a non-thyroid inhibition of hormone synthesis, drug which may cause the blockade of hormone release, a radioactive iodine, and iron inhibitors and beta blocker drugs. The most common drugs which is usually used is inhibition of hormone synthesis, which is usually propylthiouracil or methimazole. And where do they act? So it is important, as I showed, this is the pathway of formation of the thyroid gland, and the various drugs act at these levels to cause their effect, pharmacological effect. So we are supposed to know where these drugs act. Coming down to the two main drugs, that is propylthiouracil and methimazole, which are under the group of thioamides. They inhibit the hormone synthesis by inhibiting the peroxidase enzyme, which is responsible for binding of iodine to the thyroglobulin. Propylthiouracil also causes the peripheral deiodination and conversion of T4 to T3. The methimazole is more potent and long-acting than propylthiouracil. These are few things that you are supposed to know. And you have to give their treatment at least for 4 weeks before taking up any of these patients for surgery, because they are usually slow in onsets and take at least around 4 weeks for the effect to come. These drugs are used for the treatment of mild thyrotoxicosis and in preparation of surgery. And propylthiouracil is relatively safe and preferred in pregnancy. These are few things that you are supposed to know. And now, few differences between thiopropyluracil and methimazole, which is important and which are usually asked. Absorption, both are rapidly absorbed from GI. Protein binding, propylthiouracil is around 80 to 90% protein bound, while methimazole is most of the drug is free. It is not protein bound. Both get accumulated in thyroid gland. Excretion, propylthiouracil is excreted within 24 hours by kidney as inactive metabolite, while methimazole has a slow excretion and 60 to 70% of the drug is excreted unchanged over 48 hours. So half-life of methimazole is long. It's approximately around 6 hours, while from propylthiouracil it is around 1.5 hours. So it needs to be administered, propylthiouracil needs to be administered every 6 to 8 hourly, while methimazole is a single drug administration that needs to be done. Both crosses the placenta and goes up to the fetal thyroid, but the proportion of the drug crossing the placenta is less in propylthiouracil, and that is the reason why it is recommended in pregnancy. And even in breastfeeding, this drug is recommended because it is less secreted in the breast milk compared to methimazole, which is more secreted. So these are few of the differences between these two drugs. Some adverse effects from these two drugs is they may cause cutaneous reactions like urticaria, maculopapular rash, arthralgia, GI upset, hepatotoxicity, which is usually seen with methimazole and form of cholestatic jaundice. And agranulocytosis is the most common side effect, which may occur anywhere within 90 days of the treatment. So this is one of the most common adverse effects that we have to look for in a patient who is on antithyroid medication. So now another question from the postgraduates is, what is Lugol's ID and what is its use? This Lugol's iodine is used for because it blocks the organification and release of the thyroid gland. So this is something which is used for a preparation of a patient who is hyperthyroid, and we want to do the surgery at an early stage. It also decreases the size and the vascularity. There's a rapid and usually it used to be given in previously, but now it is not very commonly used, but still this is one of the questions that is being asked. What is the constituent of Lugol's iodine? Radioactive iodine is alternative to surgery, where iodine 131 is usually given. It is easy, effective, low cost, there's no pain, but it is not advisable in pregnant patients. Anion inhibitors, these are monovalent ions like perchlorate, pertecnate, thiocyanates, which competently block the uptake of iodine. They are not commonly used because of the increased chances of aplastic anemia, which is associated with these drugs. But they are effective in those patients where the patient is suffering from iodine-induced hyperthyroidism. So again, this blocks the uptake of the iodine by the thyroid gland. Propranolol is used for the management of the cardiac symptoms of thyrotoxicosis. Lithium is another drug which was used to inhibit the synthesis and release of thyroid hormone. And one thing you have to remember that amiodarone also results in hypothyroidism. So I'm leaving with this. What are the preoperative investigations? How will we manage the airway for these patients will be talked about by my subsequent speakers. But two things, yes, how will we investigate this patient? What are the different points in history that we have to take in? How will we examine this patient? How will we prepare these patients? What is Lugol's iodine? And another thing is, in hyperthyroidism, some examiners are very fond of asking what is primary and secondary hyperthyroidism. So these are a few of the questions that are usually asked by examiners, and postgraduates are supposed to know the answers of this. And I think so we can discuss these questions, or they can find the answers themselves.